Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bellevue College XR Lab podcast. My name is John Thaler. I'll be one of the hosts for today, and I'm joined by my co-host.
My name is Ron Austin, and thank you, John Thaler. This is exciting to be here to interview John Lustig. John Lustig is a person who I've been friends with for 25 years or something. It's been a really long time. And you do a comic strip called Last Kiss. Is it a comic strip or a comic panel?
It's a comic panel. It's in the comic strip, category. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And then you've also written comics for other people as well, being like Disney Comics and
Right.
Okay.
And others.
And I did not introduce myself. My title, I'm the digital learning manager at the college, and I work with John Thaler at the XR Lab. And so part of what we do is we have these podcasts where we're interviewing people who use XR or VR or work with AI in some way or just work in the arts. And so John Lustig, we're interviewing you because of the comics that you've created and then also because of some of the tech which you use with the comics, and we will get into that in a little bit. Just quickly, I'll bring up that I met you a while ago when I was working with I think it was a K through 12 private school, Assumption School in Seattle, and I was teaching in animation. I would go around and do zoetrope machines with kids, and your child Katie was one of the students in my class. And it was just this after-school class. And so you came to pick Katie up, and then you noticed that I was doing animation, and you handed me your business card. And I think you were writing for Donald Duck Comics at the time, or Gladstone, or whatever it was called. But you're writing for Donald Duck, and I was so in awe of you, John. I was like, oh my gosh! And as I just told you earlier, it was like as if I was talking with Harrison Ford, because I grew, like so many of us, I grew up with comics, and
Right.
So just meeting someone who worked behind the scenes and creating these comics, it was so cool. So I was immediately impressed, and then you introduced me to a comic group in the area called Cartoonist Northwest, and which I'm still a part of as well. So I'm curious about how you got into comics in the first place. What's your story with that?
I've been into comics since before I could read. And when I was in high school, I actually tried to get into comics back then. And I did it ass backwards and as wrong as the way you could do it. But I'll explain why I'm bringing this up but in a second. But what I did was I took a Marvel comic by Gary Conway and a Doctor Doom story, and I rewrote it. And I got my girlfriend to letter it for me, and we cut out little word balloons and pasted them over the originals. And then I mailed the comic to Gary Conway and said, I'm going to be in New York in June. We want to meet. I'd love to write Marvel.
And they sent you a contract right
Oh,
away?
of course. No, they were very nice, a very nice rejection letter considering, but I can't think of a worse way to submit to somebody by rewriting their story. But it's, in a way, it shows that was my natural way of writing, in a way of looking at visuals and then coming up with dialogue, and which is what I do with Last Kiss, which we'll get into shortly. But
well, you had been writing for a while for newspapers, right? Or other things as well?
Right. Let me go through the chronology. Okay, my next attempt to get into comics was in college, my last year, and it was 1977, I think. And I saw in Writer's Market that Gold Key Comics, Western Publishing, was open to submissions. So I wrote to them, and Dale Cannell wrote back, and he told me what to do. And so I submitted. I did a Daffy Duck Elmer Fudd story, and I actually practiced talking like Elmer Fudd, which I won't. It's just so I could get the, the verbiage down, and I will not try to repeat that. And they accepted the story, and it ran. And there's not many people alive who can say that they worked for Gold Key Comics.
How much were you paid for that? Is that
Oh,
hopefully that's okay to ask? I'm curious.
I think it was it might have been less. Might have been $20 or a page, or maybe even lower than
$20 a
that.
page, though. That's not bad. That's not bad. For
I
that
was
time.
happy to get it, and I wrote a second story, which wasn't a great story, and Dell wanted me to completely rewrite it or take a different approach, and which I took some umbrage at, but the big problem was that I just accepted my first newspaper job as a reporter editor, and I was working 60 hours a week or so, and I just didn't have time.
Right.
And so fast forward about 9-10 years later, I left newspapers. I was freelancing. I interviewed some local creators, Bill Willingham and anyway, others who were local, who were doing comics, and I began to see that maybe you could get into comics. You know, you didn't have to live in New York. So I went to the San Diego Comic-Con, now called Comics Con International, that year, and
this would have been like 1990 or so. Or?
Would have been.
Just,
I think
just
it
roughly.
would have been 80. I think it would have been 1986.
Okay.
Might have been 85. You know, I went by various publishers' table, and I stopped at the Blackthorn table, and they were open to me submitting. In fact, the fact that I was a reporter was a plus. As the editor said, "You were a reporter? Oh, great! You can spell.
Right? Yeah.
Let's say that the level of was a little lower then to get in, and this was during the black and white independent boom when there were 4 zillion small publishers coming out. So they needed a lot of stuff, and they were doing a lot of different comics, including rip-offs of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I wasn't real enthused about some of their titles. I would have done anything, but I looked at their table and they had this one comic, Nervous Rex, which I had read and loved. And I said, "Oh, I really like this." And he said, "Well, the creator, William Van Horn, is open to plot submissions."
So that's how you met William Van Horn.
Yes.
Okay.
And I submitted, and Bill used my plots in what turned out to be the last issue of Nervous Rex.
Okay.
And then Bill later went on to work for Disney, for Gladstone Comics, and he kind of brought me along after a little bit, and I started writing for them, and
so I don't
that's
know
how I got
about,
in.
Okay, so I don't know about Nervous Wreck. What type of comic is that?
It's a little hard to describe. It's kind of it's a little bit like Crazy Cat.
Igmus? Is it Igmus Mouse? Or
Yeah. But I was trying to think of the name of the creator. But George Harriman, yes.
Yeah.
The art style is very similar to that in a way, and it looked like a kid's comic in many ways, but it wasn't. And it was a story about a small Tyrannosaurus, and this is Bigfoot, somewhat Bigfoot style cartooning, a small Tyrannosaurus who was henpecked by his much larger wife. And it was just insane stuff and beautiful use of dialogue and puns that were way too old for most kids and so forth. And it was a great comic. And in fact, it just got reprinted recently.
Do you consider yourself an author, an artist? When you refer to the work that you do, what's the title you use?
I'm 90% writer, but these days I have reluctantly go by the term cartoonist. But even though I don't really draw, if it wasn't for Photoshop and Illustrator and the way I manipulate old art, I would be lost. But there really isn't a good term for exactly what I do.
But you do see yourself as a writer. I mean, your stories kind of back that up, and that's what I was getting.
Yeah. I am definitely a writer.
I mean, even professionally, the fact that you were a reporter for a newspaper kind of backs that up.
Yeah, and the reason I went into journalism is because it was the only way I could be sure I could get paid for writing, you know? So.
Well, so outside of Last Kiss, you wrote for Donald Duck, you wrote for Daffy Duck. Anything else which you had done?
Well, for Disney, I mostly wrote Donald Duck, and I did a lot of Uncle Scrooge. I did a few Mickey Mouse stories. I did some DuckTales, including the adaptation of the graphic novel of the movie.
Oh, you did that?
Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
that's amazing.
So
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, that's way back in 1990. I wrote some stories for some issues of a series called Marvel Romance Redux, which was basically doing Last Kiss, but it was, except I was using Marvel artwork, and I got to do 3 dialogue story by Jack Kirby and Gene Colan and Don Heck. For Viz, I did the English adaptation of a 5-book series called Ultramaniac, which was kind of insane, but it was actually the most fun I've ever had because I didn't have to worry about plot. I just went in and spruced up the dialogue and tried to make it a little funnier, you know, and got paid very little, but I wrote very quickly. So that was fun. I did a Martha Stewart paper doll, which appeared in the Last Kiss comic book.
Was that back when she was going to prison at that time? That would be a long time ago.
I created that before she was convicted.
Okay.
And the comic came out just like the week she got sentenced or convicted, and it ended up selling out for the most part. But the reason I'm mentioning that is Cracked Magazine liked it and reprinted it in Cracked magazines. So that was another thing. Okay. I wrote some stories for a 3-issue series based on the old Eek the Cat TV show, animated show. And I might be leaving a few things out, but those are sort of the highlights.
So Last Kiss, right? It's your current project.
Yeah.
What is the context for it? We've actually mentioned it a couple times thus far, but assume for a moment that someone listening to this has no idea what Last Kiss is. How would you explain it to them?
Unfortunately, most people don't know what it is. But this podcast is going to change that.
Of course.
Yeah. Anyway, Last Kiss is me taking old comic art, for the most part, and redialing it and being with snarky dialogue and so forth. And how I got into that, which is, again, ironic considering my first attempt to get into comics. In the late 1980s, it might have been 86, it was about the time I started with doing Disney comics. Charlton Comics was going out of business, and they were selling off their intellectual properties and copies of their file copies and so forth. And it was mostly oddball stuff at that point that was left. But I had this crazy idea that maybe I could re-dialogue some of the comics. I didn't really know what I would do it. I didn't necessarily think I was going to do it for laughs. So I decided to take a chance on this, but I was cheap, and I didn't have a lot of money. So I bought the series that had the most issues for the least amount of money, and I bought it blind without seeing the series, any of the issues. I ended up with the rights to all 40 issues of First Kiss for $400.
Sounds like a steal.
Yeah, well, it does now, but I was ribbed by it by a good friend in the business for years, like, you bought Charlton artwork. And when I got it, I didn't really know what to expect because I didn't know Charlton that well, and I didn't know romance comics. And when I got it, let's say, well, Charlton paid the lowest page rates in the industry, and so artists had to be really fast. So it wasn't always the most beautiful artwork. There was some nice art, but most of it was pretty mediocre. And I didn't, I should have known, but romance art, it's mostly picture after picture of young women having angst, romantic angst, and medium to close-up shots. And there's very little action, partially because it would take longer to draw that. And so coming from like a Marvel Comics background and even a Disney background, having all these static images, it threw me. I didn't know what to do with it. So it was $400. I put it in a drawer, and I just didn't think about it for a few years, except for whenever my friend would rip me about it.
So, John, I have a question about the format. So when you got 40 issues of the comics, what format was this in? Were they in a large format, like 12 by whatever, 12 by 9 or whatever?
I didn't get the original art. What I got were copies of the file comics, but I got the photostats.
Oh, okay.
Which are supposedly high quality, like photocopies. Some of them were in pretty bad shape. Needed a lot of cleaning up later on when I scanned. So anyway, fast forward another 9 years or so, I was sick in bed, but not so sick that I was just to the point where I was too sick to get up and work, but I was so bored.
You were sick of being sick in bed.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And so I got out these old copies of First Kiss, and I started looking at them, and I started writing gags for the covers. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but later that year I made photocopies, and I didn't letter it. I just typed it up and put little blocks of paper on the covers.
Just like your first comic that you did.
Yeah, exactly. But I made photocopies, and I took them to San Diego Comic-Con, and I ended up showing them to Don and Maggie Thompson at Comics Buyer's Guide, which was really the trade publication for comic at the time. And they liked them, and so I started doing these. But it wasn't exactly a big success, and it wasn't played up. And I did it for a couple of years, then I kind of took a couple of years off, but I came back to CBG, and at a convention I said, hey, how would you like me to do something for the Valentine's issue? And they said, great. And so I did a 3-page Last Kiss story, and I ended up doing the cover, which by that point I taught myself how to color. It was kind of a hit, and they asked me to do more, and except they wanted like a 2-panel thing. So so I started writing these long opening captions and using 2 or 3 panels, and I was telling little stories in them, and that went really well. And for the next 13 years until they went out of business, I was doing that. Then that led to everything that spun off from that.
Well, actually, so how long have you been doing Last Kiss? Like about 15, 16 years now?
Well, the first Last Kiss appearance was in Comic Buyer's Guide in 1996.
Oh my God.
So it's almost 40 years.
30 years.
30 years.
All right. So you spoke to this a little bit, but what other changes have occurred in the comic and how you present the comic?
Well, let me talk about my expectations for Last Kiss. When I started doing it, I had no idea what it was going to be. I had no idea I'd be doing it 28 years later.
Right.
I had no idea that it would spin off. I did a 4-issue comic book. I could have done more, but I got busy with other things. And I was still writing for Disney during all this. I did that for at least 25 years. I ended up doing merchandising and licensing, a lot of licensing for merchandise. I still do a little bit of licensing. It was in a couple of newspapers, including the Seattle Times for a year.
Seattle Times for a
Yeah,
while. I
yeah,
remember that.
yeah. I was their most expensive comic, and the first to be axed when they started having financial issues. And I didn't know I was going to expand, and I certainly didn't know that I would find success on the web.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my biggest audience, I've branched into doing, I still mostly use romance art, and not just from First Kiss, but from other series. I found other ways to get art from the public domain comics or things that I've bought the rights to. And I've done quite a few jungle comics art, horror for like Halloween, all kinds of genres. I've branched into occasionally using photos, either like stills from old silent movies or even new photos. I've got a friend, Felina V, who has appeared in a number pinup art that I've redialogued, and I've done others. And that I'd be working with artists who I mostly turn the coloring over to and sometimes fix up the art for me. And even occasionally there's been new art. So I had no idea any of that was my future, and I had no idea how much work it was going to be and how much I would have to learn how to use Photoshop and Illustrator and other things, and that I would be lettering my own comics.
The next question.
Yeah, it's a great segue into our next question, actually. So earlier you mentioned that you do absolutely consider yourself a writer at heart, right?
Yeah.
That's where your roots are.
Right.
But you just mentioned that due to Last Kiss, you've had to branch out and learn some of these other art skills in order to continue. Right. And so our next question here is, we want to know, what are some of these technologies that you use to create art? You've mentioned a couple, like Photoshop, but please tell us about some of the art tools, if any, that you haven't mentioned, that you use in this production pipeline.
Okay, well, 90% of it is Photoshop and Illustrator. Photoshop to clean up art, to occasionally I'll put in a new background detail or something, extend a line or something, or take out backgrounds. And occasionally I'll still color something, but I try not to. But there are times where I have to change the colors that the artist that I've employed have already done, because it doesn't work with the gag, or I just want to give the art a new look if that's the fourth time I'm using the art. And I do most of my lettering in Illustrator, which isn't unusual in the field. And, the panel borders and captionings and so forth. And I increasingly am, and I'm not going to say where exactly I'm getting it, but there are resources online and digital sources that I have of old artwork, but it's not at the level of the res that I would like. So I'll use something like Gigaplex to up the
upscale it.
Yeah,
the
upscale, which used to be something that didn't even exist.
But now there's technology that can do that.
And we might as well say this, and part of the reason for that is the use of AI in these programs too. So
that's right. There's this new thing called AI, right?
And I'm
being a bit sarcastic,
and I've used some filters and so forth, but that's the main stuff.
Well, so we're touching on this a bit, but can you go into more detail about which ones you use? AI tools. So.
I've experimented with several, but I pretty much just used Midjourney because I thought the graphics were the most beautiful, the most finished. And every AI system, and I haven't played with ChatGPT, or I played a little bit with one or two writing with ones just to look at them, but I haven't used anything for writing. Every generative AI tool is different, and it just was easier just to stick with Midjourney.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things I should explore.
So in your process of using Midjourney,
Right.
how do you use Midjourney in your process? Are you using it to generate new art? Are you using it to touch up old art? Where does it play a role in your workflow?
Well, to start out with, I mostly used it to generate new art. And it's been over a two-plus year range. I wasn't one of the first people, but I came in pretty early. I would just go in there and play around and see what I could generate. And in some ways, it was very much like redialoguing old comics, in that because you would try to come up with an image and you would never get what you asked for. So I'd have to change it. And, if I had an idea going in, I'd have to change the idea. And over the last 2 years, for the main image, I've only used AI maybe 20 times.
Total.
Yeah, total. In a couple weeks, there'll be 21.
Mm-hmm.
I've started using AI for background art. I still use online photo site and a clip art site, sometimes for backgrounds or even occasionally even main characters. And knowing that I was going to do this interview, I actually have spent more time playing around with it the last few days. I really like it for background art. Occasionally, I remember a couple times I needed, there was one time when I needed a tire, a car tire. So I used that, and I couldn't find anything online, so I created it in Midjourney. And there was another time when I needed a pair of red slippers sitting by itself, and it was easier to create it in Midjourney than I couldn't find anything online that I wanted.
You're using it to create aspects of whatever you need for the context.
Right.
So you're telling a story, and you have these panels that are either in the open source or from something like First Kiss, and then you have an idea in your head of something you want, and you will use AI to create an object or a background or something for the context of it?
Well, it's both. Sometimes I've just played around. I've got Halloween's coming up, and maybe it's my newspaper background, but I try to do things for the different holidays, and even small holidays sometimes, like Arbor Day or Anyway, and so I've got something in mind, but you just start playing around for Halloween with horror images, and maybe I'll have an idea in mind. But as AI has gotten better, I have sometimes been able to go for specific images. It might take me 40 or 50 attempts to get it right, and I might have to modify the gag, but I've backpedaled some. I'm not doing that as much lately, and I'll get into why shortly. Right now, it's mostly background art.
So you had mentioned earlier that sometimes it wasn't giving you exactly what you wanted. Do you find that that's improving over the course of the last 2 years?
Yeah. The thing about AI, and I hadn't done anything for several months with AI, actually, since January. It's changing so fast, and it's getting better. Some of the AI platforms, and Midjourney came in eventually added this, where you go into in-painting, and where you can go in and have it remove certain parts of the art and ask it to replace that hole with something else. It doesn't always do what you want either, but it makes it closer.
But you can use that to remove and replace a background in a panel?
Yeah. But you can use that to replace a specific, if Midjourney makes a mistake and has a hand coming out of a head, you can
select that and say no.
Right. I've also learned in many cases, it's easier to ask, if you're trying to get a character, ask for the character and then ask for the background separately, because it confuses too much confuses Midjourney.
It's sort of like if you were to say, you start using colors, and you're like, I'd like a red shirt and blue pants, and then it can take the red and the blue and put them in different parts of the images.
Right. Well, yeah. It's getting better at interpreting things. The longer you use it, the controls get better and you learn more, but there's kind of an art to even using it, to be honest.
So this probably goes along with what you were just saying about doing the background separate from the subject. But one of the things that I find about AI is that it can be very complex images. There's lots of detail in the images, which is kind of counterintuitive to comics in a way, right? Because comics often have a simple style. Has there been an issue there with you for that, or are you able to get it simplified for you?
Been a lot of cases where I've used the background that came with it. Usually the background's appropriate, but not always. It's just a different look. Yes, with the old comic panels, I've actually, I started reproducing them as is, with all the badly drawn window blinds and shades and background detail and very, very bad art in the background on the walls. And, as I've gotten further into it, I started working with an artist, Diego Jordan Piera, started taking out the backgrounds and putting his own in. And I go, and sometimes they were very abstract backgrounds, just splashes of color and so forth. And I go, that's a really good look. And I'm sure he did it partially for artistic sake, but also it simplifies the art and it draws your eyesight to the central part of the image. We've started doing that more and more with Last Kiss. So it's kind of natural to sometimes to approach the background separately in AI.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense just in terms of from an artistic perspective, drawing the attention to the subject, and you don't always want a super distracting background. Right.
It became more important was doing licensing art because you want very dynamic images and,
Yeah. So thus far, we've kind of talked about the technical aspects and capacity of AI and the tools and the art. But can you tell us about maybe some of the feedback that you've received from other creatives about the use of AI? This is kind of a loaded question, admittedly.
Yes, and I'm ready for it.
Well, a little backstory about it is that one of the reasons we're doing the interview is because you and I saw each other at a party a few months ago, and then you said that you're doing AI, and I come at it from a few different points of view. One is that I'm a cartoonist by hobby, and so then I have a passion for hand-drawn art.
Sure.
But here I am at the XR lab, and I'm surrounded by AI and people who work with it, so I'm very much in the middle. But when you told me that, I admittedly was kind of on guard, right? And I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah. And so are you getting that from anyone else? How's that going?
Well, of course I'm getting that from...
All right.
I have not talked to, and when I'm using artist in the term in this sense of somebody who actually draws, and creators I've worked with or creators I know, none of them like AI. And I totally understand that. And sometimes I find AI too slick, the look too slick. But I understand the ethical concerns. I understand the job security considerations. I haven't experienced it as much with writers because I don't think AI has made inroads in fiction and comics and so forth, although people are trying to do AI, at least with in terms of artwork with AI. There's some real challenges with that. AI hasn't made the inroads in fiction. I mean, I've seen one or two attempts at children's books, very young children, and it's very simple and it's serviceable, but it's not anything surprising or really good.
Right.
Astoundingly mediocre, maybe. at best.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting because the way that you're using the AI actually works in with the history of your comic strip.
Yes, it does.
So it's this interesting paradigm.
Right.
Right.
I've got a couple of people who, I'm getting people lately submitting to me all the time gags, and sometimes the one that came out today is by my brother-in-law. Mike Pascal for years has been revamping old artwork for me, and for holidays, he turning love art into, the characters into zombies for Halloween and so forth. And he'll usually submit gags with those. And sometimes I use his as is. I've also been very fortunate and lucky in having different creators want to submit to me. But a legend in comic books has been doing gags for me for the last couple of years. And he actually did submit some gags for me specifically for AEI because he knew I'd use some. And he had another creator see it online, and he was just savaged by this creator, and somebody I know too. And it kind of made him rethink that. And he's back
because the
because
quality.
Because she claims, and she probably is right, that her artwork had been used to train some of these AI programs. And she just took great offense to anybody doing AI. That's made me kind of back off a little bit, but I'm still planning to use AI.
How about, here's one for you, copyright concerns.
Okay. There's different ways of looking at that. From a strictly utilitarian aspect, you don't want to use AI art exactly as is because it is not copyrightable.
Recently, it's been ruled, I believe, that you can't have AI created stuff be intellectual property because it's not made by anyone.
Right.
So does that mean you can add like a little smudge in Photoshop and then now you can copyright it?
It does mean that you should make a change to it that hopefully is substantial.
I mean, you've got kind of two perspectives. You've kind of got a corporate perspective, which is nothing in the end product should have AI for liability's sake because it has to be owned by whoever it is that's like publishing it, kind of thing. That's one perspective.
Unless you make enough changes to it.
But that's kind of the other one is that if you start from somewhere with AI purely as a starting point, and then the rest of it you do yourself, at which point you can now claim it's your own.
Right. The other perspective, though, is the copyrights of the people whose work were used to train.
Especially without consent. That's
right,
major
and without
issue.
Consent, right. And virtually almost all of it has been used without consent. And that, I think, from a member of the creative community, there are two concerns. There's that concern, and there's also the concern that this is going to put people out of work. A couple of people who do AI have actually come up with a website that will help creators find out if their art has been used to train AI, and the site is Have I Been Trained? And the idea is to find out if art's been used by AI, and then to help you leverage that into getting them to either remove it from their files or work a deal so that you get some money for it. Hopefully, eventually, we'll figure this thing out. I am very, I don't want people to be ripped off. When I was first experimenting with AI, I wasn't really worried about that or thinking about that. But increasingly, I try to use artists who, if I'm referring to an artist who's no longer working, who's dead, who maybe is dead for centuries, or it's harder with comics, of course. But
you've been really good about providing credit for the artist. I think every time I look, I think I've seen you give credit to an artist. or
Yeah,
the
yeah.
vast majority of time.
Yes, the vast majority. There have been a couple of periods when I first started out, I wasn't doing that, and when I first started out on Go Comics for the first year or so, I wasn't providing credits because I was afraid it was going to confuse people, and I didn't know how many comic fans there were, but people got the gist of it pretty quickly.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I try to, and when I use art, at least I don't let people know if I've used it for a background, but if I've used it for a main character or in a major way, I always say AI magic or something like that.
Right.
I try to give as full credits for everything as I can.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's honorable, honestly, both in giving credit to artists, but also being upfront about when you're using
Right.
AI. I think it gives the reader that honest intent of
Right.
kind of informing them of what they're seeing. Now, earlier you had mentioned, as we were talking about the ethical aspects,
Mhm.
that one of the most controversial points of AI art is how it is using or trained on artists.
Right.
And so I think that's a problem of the majority, if not all, AI art right now.
Mhm.
But the one that I've heard of that seems to be going in the right direction is on Adobe's side. They have Firefly now. It's built into their Photoshop program. And at least they claim
Right.
that it is trained only on open source Adobe stock and opt-in artists.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. First of all, I think AI is here to stay, whatever you think about it. And the fact that it's now in Photoshop and Illustrator and Adobe products and so many other programs that are coming down the line, it's pretty mainstream at this point. As far as Adobe stuff goes, I think that's a good way to go, but the fact that using Adobe stock, isn't that kind of taking money out of hands of people who did the Adobe stock? So it's not a perfect solution.
Yeah, I would agree with that. At the
Yeah.
very least, it comes from the perspective that Adobe at least had, I'm assuming, ownership over everything that was submitted to them as stock.
I'm not sure how that worked.
So-
I guess I assumed that people who did Adobe stock were getting paid whenever the image
Mhm.
was.
Because Adobe takes me as one of those
but-
corporations
But they
that
probably do. It's probably like working for Disney once you.
Mhm. Once
Yeah.
you've given it to them, it's
Yeah.
Disney's now.
But
right?
it's still
I think it's something where most artists didn't realize what was going to happen.
right.
I-
Right.
And
I would
then it
agree with
happened,
that.
Right,
they're
right,
like,
right.
Oh, but in the contract, I think that it is legal, right?
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Right.
And Adobe stock is going to be mostly
Right.
photos as opposed to drawn art.
That's true.
It doesn't do as good a job on drawn art.
If anything, that's probably a good sign that it doesn't do as well on drawn art because it speaks to the legitimacy of their claim, at
Mhm.
least,
Right,
that
right.
they're holding themselves to the stricter standard of what they train their AI on.
Yeah. And I will say, from what I don't play around with photo representational art usually in Midjourney, but from what I can tell, it actually does a better job on photorealistic art too. Anyway, I think AI is here to stay, and there is this kind of weird gray area, and maybe I'm reaching, but when you're starting out in the arts, you're often patterning yourself after other writers or other artists,
Mhm.
and eventually you learn your trade and you create your own
Yeah.
style. But you
It
learn.
kind of goes back to
Yeah.
the Renaissance era
Yeah,
of learning under a master artist.
Right.
Where and this is still seen in art schools rather recently, where they will tell you to recreate a very classical art piece.
Right.
And they do this because you learn the techniques and the theories behind what made that art in the first place
Right.
as you're recreating it as an assignment.
Right.
And I will just say that I have different influences and trainings. When I was writing for Disney, it was tremendously useful to me that I was a Disney Comics fan, and particularly a Carl Barks fan who created so many, all the really best Disney comic of his era, frankly, of any era. And I'm reaching my arms out to both sides. I've got this many books of collecting all of his work, and I would read that stuff over and over again, and I learned a lot about storytelling from that. But the reason I'm bringing this up, and I probably obviously, is now we've got AI doing that. It's different, but it's the same thing that any of us could be doing on a personal level. The difference is that it's a machine that's being mass-produced, and it can create something so instantaneously.
And it can create something eerily similar, right? Where it's AI, so it usually will do it wrong, at least in some regard.
Right.
But it's eerily similar, and especially in these cases where, artists did not want, comply, or have consent in their art being used for training, then it gets into I think a larger ethical issue.
Knowing we were going to talk about this issue, I was playing around in Midjourney, and I was thinking, well, what are and one of the great things that people don't talk enough about it is you can take something that never here's an example. I actually did this on AI just to see what it was like. What if you had to do a book cover for a new Zorro, and you wanted to see what Rembrandt would have done? And so I created a Zorro done in the style of Rembrandt, and it was actually kind of cool, So there's these really interesting things that really don't infringe on things, but my feeling about AI is it's here to stay. Every new technology, and this isn't a new thought really, but every new technology displaces some workers. But it almost always, if it's a major technology, always creates new jobs. Personal computers, we didn't know all the things that was going to lead to. TV was supposed to get rid of film, but instead it just created more jobs. Cars replacing, horses. I mean, think of all the things that, created. So we don't know where that's going to go. It's just too early, but it's going to happen. Hopefully it won't. I still want artists to be able to create, and if I don't, it's kind of uncomfortable for those of us who are artists or creators. The idea of just Joe Blow off the street, who maybe he's 12 years old, creating a masterpiece of art or so forth. But, it's going to be what it is.
Well, what do you think about your own strip in a few years from now? Like just 2 or 5 years from now, regardless of AI or not?
I don't know. To be honest, I'm 71, and it depends on my health, and I'm actually trying to find...
Well, that means that you're like just midway through your career, right?
Yeah, I'm just middle-aged.
Yeah.
And I'm actually trying to find more time for my personal, and I'm in a very comfortable spot right now where I'm mostly creating for my main market is on Go Comics, and which has been great. So I'm very comfortable just doing it as a web comic and occasionally doing some merchandise and so forth. But I'd like to get some books out. I'm trying to find ways to be more efficient, and so I've got more time. And unfortunately, the farther I get into Last Kiss, the more it seems like I spend my time not writing and doing all these other things, from art to posting on webs to learning new technology. And I love learning, but I would like to get some books out. That would be some collections out.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I was at a friend's house about 6 years ago, and they had a Last Kiss sticker on their.
Oh, really?
Yeah, or
magnet.
Magnet.
Yeah.
It was on their fridge.
I need to do stickers.
I was like, I know that person.
Yeah.
And it gets back to the Harrison Ford moment.
Yeah, I get mistaken for Harrison Ford all the time.
It's your charming demeanor, I'm sure.
It is. But I wanted to tell people where they could see Last Kiss. My website is lastkiss.us or lastkisscomics.com. The site that most people see me on is gocomics.com/lastkiss. So.
All right. And those links, as well as any other links that I find related to what we've talked about today, will be in the description. So.
I can't wait to be famous.
Oh, exactly. This will definitely be what blows up, I'm sure.
Okay.
Well, thank you for driving out to the college and appearing with us in the studio, and it's always good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's always
Appreciate
good
it.
to see you.
Yeah.
One last time, this was the Bellevue College XR Lab podcast. I was John Thaler.
I am Ron Austin.
And I'm John Lustig.
And thank you for listening and joining us today.
Thank you.